can management and performance success actually be learned? And this is a really, really tricky question from many different perspectives. So I actually want to talk about this, whether management actually can be learned and whether we can learn how to become more successful in our lives. And I'm going to define management rather broadly in that you are managing any particular resources in your life. So if you're an individual, you might be managing your own individual resources that you have access to. So this might be, your time, or maybe it is your financial resources. Maybe if you're running a large multinational corporation, you might be thinking about like managing subsidiaries and divisions and all that kind of stuff. And that this is a really tricky question, and whether we can actually learn to get better as managers for a lot of different reasons. And I'm going to talk about that. So if you don't know me, I am Professor Dave Massack. I'm Associate Professor of Innovation Strategy and Entrepreneurship, and I create this whole Reciprocity Project to give back as much as I possibly can. There's so many people that help me out that I want to pay the favor forward to help you out as much as I possibly can. So this whole project started out as kind of like this editing platform where you can get feedback on your work. I'm trying to sort of change how we do work, so go check that out. And that's what reciprocity.com is. The E is written with a 3. So anyways, can management be learned, and what is going on there? So two perspectives that I would think about. One of them being the organizational behavior perspective, and where we're looking at, basically the benefits and ailments of management practices within, and as well, not management practices, but people within companies. And much of that research is what's called cross-sectional. So it's going to be done with, survey-based research and stuff like that. And it's in, they might be looking, and they might sort of, the gist of it, I hate to say this because, my organizational behavior colleagues are probably going to, they're probably not going to like this, but the gist of it is try to be a nice person. And, that's going to help out, right? So think about all the things that what a nice person would be, right? They're giving of their time, that they like to share with people. They tend to be a little bit more charismatic, that they might be chatty. They might do, just go above and beyond charismatic, what's the word I'm looking for? That they, I'm blanking on the word, but that they're very giving of themselves, and that generally leads to better organizations, right? And basically, a nice culture that propagates that, really does matter, and that's the gist of the entire field. And the negative behaviors that you sort of imagine, going back to kindergarten. Those sort of negative behaviors of, greed and things like that are bad for organizations. I know I hate to generalize, but that there really is some truth to that. The problem with these particular studies, a lot of the studies, it doesn't necessarily show how these behaviors get learned and whether we can learn these things, right? So we know that they do matter, and they matter across people, but we don't necessarily know if they can be learned. And, it's really particularly challenging to sort of know whether some of this stuff can be learned, because learning is a hard thing, right? We have some pretty good evidence in terms of the outcomes of this, right? So if we teach these courses and things like that, organizational behavior, it seems to have somewhat of an effect, right? There's a study on economics where if golly, I think it's Staw who wrote it, and was looking at the impact of taking an economics course or being economics majors, and it shows that they tend to be a little bit more self-interested and things like that. But that doesn't show that those people weren't necessarily self-interested in the first place, right? It just shows that taking those courses can lead to those behaviors. It's actually really hard to show the impact of education Some economists look at this, and it's still really hard to sort of tease that apart in terms of that effect. You know, the other thing, or the other angle to look at, is from a strategy lens. Except for most of the strategy research takes a really abstract approach, and so as strategy is really interested in how firms actually can improve and get better over time, and they take an abstract approach where it's hard to get the data. So what we end up doing is gathering data on secondary sources, right? So looking at things like, looking at annual reports and things like that. So it doesn't necessarily get at individuals per se. And we often use sort of demographic measures and stuff to get at, senior level managers. And it doesn't get at what's going on in a company. It's really tricky to get at these things, to look at, if you were trained and you were properly given, the skills and assets and stuff like that, the resources, are you going to learn to become a better manager? I think the best sort of we can go to understanding where you can learn to become a better manager is actually looking at sort of counseling research and thinking about what they go through, right? And I don't know that field very well, but I kind of sort of briefly understand, sort of the gist of it, right? So if you go to become, you go to counseling, or you go to see a psychiatrist, or a psychologist, if you go and talk to them and you're actively engaged and you're part of that, you probably have pretty good outcomes from that, right? So if you intentionally want to become a better person, and you want to grow and develop, and it's you that's driving it, you are going to probably get some outcomes from that, right? Because you're going to be very conscientious with this. But if you are not inclined to do that, and I'm assuming that there's probably some model out there that sort of shows this, right? If you're not inclined to necessarily do this, then, you're being sort of dragged there, or you have to take, these sort of courses and things like that, then the outcomes are usually not that good, right? Like, then you're not going to learn and develop and become a good person. So it's really hard to sort of get people to, you can't do an intervention, right? Interventions are not going to be as successful as somebody when they hit rock bottom and they realize that they need to make a change and they need to do something. So, that's the thing to realize, is that it's hard to get evidence on this kind of stuff, and it's hard to grow, or it's hard to see whether we can become better managers. But, what I can only draw from, and the only lessons that I can sort of look at is my own personal life. And some of the stuff that I have is naturally sort of embedded. I'm endowed with a lot of sort of, things like I'm empathetic, and, those kind of things probably come somewhat naturally to me. But a lot of other things I've sort of learned and developed. A lot of the hard skills, for example, I've had to learn and develop and grow and get that capability for that. But, some of the softer stuff, I've had to go through experience and gain that experience, and what it means to live life, and to what it means to sort of get to that moment where you're like, oh crap, my life is finite, and I have to think about, what am I going to do in this world, right? And those kind of things are really powerful to go through, and not everybody goes through those things. But you have to reflect on what those mean in terms of what you're going to do. And you can sort of, and the reaction when you come to that, right? Like, depending on who you are as a person, you might say, hey, I have a limited amount of time. I'm going to be as greedy and, power hungry as possible. Or the opposite, where you're going to say, hey, I got a limited amount of time. I'm going to try to be nice and generous and grow, my influence as much as possible. So, that there is a lot that goes on in terms of this. And so can you definitively say, that you can become a better manager and you sort of lead to more success? The answer is, it's really hard to show this. What we do know, there's a really good study that is incredible by, it's Harvard, or not Harvard, a Stanford economist. I'm blanking on his name now. Lots of people know this. The paper is called What Does Management Matter? and they look at management practices and implementation in India. It costs millions of dollars to do this thing. It's a really big project. And there is evidence that actually you can have performance improvements with management and getting taught some of these things, those sort of basic things. But it's not, so you might think like all of this stuff is going to be some big grand insight and stuff, but it's not, right? It's very simple things. And they're very simple sort of life lessons, cleaning up. This was, just cleaning up the factory floor is like, that's a big thing, right? That was like a huge insight, and that sort of added a lot. It goes back to realizing the stuff that you get taught in kindergarten, the stuff that you get taught in first grade, in second grade and third grade, in terms of how to work with others, keep a nice room, do things on a regular basis that are sort of improving you in sort of the functions of your life that you would like to improve, right? So getting exercise, communicating, working on that's really hard for me. Doing things where you're sort of growing your knowledge in certain domains, like really simple things, right? Like reading. Very simple things actually do add up. But the thing is, in the short term, this is what everybody gets really stuck with. And that's why I try to encourage people to do things on this channel and try to sort of, just give them confidence. Really, that's at the end of the day, is that these things are, you think that they happen in a decade, or you think that you happen in less than a decade, right? Like a year to 5 years. That's actually really short. And that's probably too short to sort of develop and become good at something. And to be, just to learn this, right? You have to think in terms of decades, multiple decades, to sort of see where you're going. And that's what makes it sort of challenging to know whether you are actually doing a good job and you're learning. It's because this stuff is decades long, right? And if you would have had an insight on the first year of the first decade, that takes a long time to grow and develop and become, what it is. And the outcomes are not going to happen for many, many years before you actually see a positive outcome. And in fact, most of the time, you see a negative outcome at the beginning of virtually everything that you do in your life. You're going to see negative outcomes. Your muscles are going to be sore when you go back to, working out, and you're not going to want to do it. All of those things are really negative impacts, but it takes a long time to get to the point where you actually start feeling good about doing these things. And, management is the same way. People are going to be skeptical when you sort of all of a sudden change a new leaf. It's true, it takes an awful lot of time. So think in terms of, decades. Think in terms of not like one action, but thinking, okay, if I repeat this action 5,000 times or 10,000 times or 100,000 times, what is that going to mean? So, that's why it's so important for me to communicate to you, to be a part of your life, to realize that, hey, you're a good person. Just keep it up. Just keep doing these things day in and day out, and just have courage every day. Those small lessons from kindergarten, those kindergarten teachers, we should pay them more. They actually know a lot. They know a lot more than we give them credit for. So thanks so much, actually, to all the kindergarten teachers out there. All right, with that, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Take care, and have a wonderful day. Bye.